Good evening, my dear friends, and welcome to tonight's tale, The Holly Cottage Mystery, a Miss Marple story. Picture, if you will, a quiet English village on an autumn evening, where the first frost has silvered the hedgerows and smoke curls lazily from cottage chimneys. Inside, lamplight glows warmly, teapots steam, and conversations drift as gently as the falling leaves. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, secrets wait, secrets only a sharp eye might uncover. So settle in with your favorite cup of tea. Tell me, if you lived in such a village, would you keep secrets or reveal them? The December air in Marleycombe carried with it the crisp promise of Christmas. Holly Cottage, with its ivy-draped walls and twinkling frost upon the eaves, had been lent most generously for the church fete, and inside, the rooms glowed with warmth and cheer. Ladies in stout winter coats clustered around tables laden with knitted scarves and jars of jam, while the vicar's wife presided proudly over a teapot steaming with spiced brew. A hum of laughter and gossip filled the hall, punctuated now and then by the clink of coins dropped into the charity box. By the hearth, Mrs. Pennington declared rather too loudly that Mrs. Dawlish's fruit-cake was dry as dust, while others admired the bright holly wreaths hanging in neat rows against the wall. Children darted between skirts and coat-tails, pockets secretly bulging with sugared almonds. For all its merriment, the gathering felt as cozy and timeless as any English village fete. And then, without warning, the mood broke. A sharp gasp, a shudder, and one guest crumpled to the floor beside the holly display, eyes glazed, teacups slipping from their grasp. Silence fell, heavy and absolute, until it broke into startled cries. Among the holly and roses, suspicion quietly bloomed. A mystery had begun. Chapter 1. Tea, Tattle, and Uneasy Footsteps. The morning after the fete, Marleycombe was abuzz. The village, so small that every cough and quarrel was noted, now had a death to chew over, and the gossip mill ground with unusual ferocity. At the bakery, Mr. Trumbull leaned on his counter, flour still dusting his sleeves, and declared to anyone who would listen that the poor fellow had been poisoned. "Mark my words," he said, jabbing the air with a doughy finger. "You don't keel over like that from nothing." Mrs. Pym, stout and pink-cheeked, countered at once. She was waiting for her scones to be wrapped, and saw no reason not to pronounce her verdict loudly. "Nonsense, pure nonsense. It was his heart, it must have been. Didn't you see how red in the face he looked? A weak heart will do it." The argument carried out into the cobbled lane, where villagers lingered longer than usual, their errands forgotten. The talk was full of sharp certainty, though none had more than half a fact. Some recalled a quarrel overheard, others muttered about debts unpaid, and still others preferred the dramatic notion of poison slipped into tea. Miss Marple, seated demurely at the post-office with her knitting-bag at her feet and a modest cup of tea in her hand, said very little. She merely smiled her faint, distracted smile, as though her thoughts were elsewhere. Yet her ears, sharp as any, caught every word, and her mind quietly filed them away. By the following afternoon, the official word had been given. Constable Evans, a man of good heart but rather limited imagination, announced with quiet confidence that the unfortunate death at Holly Cottage was likely nothing more than natural causes. "A fainting fit, perhaps the heart," he declared, pulling at his collar as though the uniform itself made him warmer than he liked. To his mind, There was little sense in disturbing the peace of Marleycombe with talk of darker deeds. But the villagers were not satisfied. Whispers moved swifter than the winter wind, curling from parlor to parlor, and they carried with them far more sinister suggestions. Old Mrs. Arkwright claimed she had heard of a long-standing quarrel between the deceased and a cousin over property lines. The schoolmistress, Miss Cray, hinted at financial irregularities, though when pressed she could produce no detail at all. Most pointed of all was the vicar's wife, who remembered, with no small drama, an argument at the fete itself. She insisted she had seen two figures near the holly table, their voices sharp, their expressions tense. "It quite spoiled the atmosphere," she confided over a plate of seed cake, lowering her voice only slightly. "One does not expect raised voices at a charity gathering." The suspicion spread like ivy, clinging to every possible surface. The polite version was that tempers had run high over planning arrangements. But in hushed tones, when curtains were safely drawn, villagers speculated that grudges older and darker than fate committees had found their moment beneath the holly. And in her quiet corner, Miss Marple listened. In the days that followed, Marleycombe resumed its outward rhythm. The church bell still rang at matins, the milk cart clattered along the lanes, and smoke rose in tidy curls from every cottage chimney. Yet, beneath the comforting patterns of village life, there lingered a tautness that could not be disguised. Greetings were offered with too bright smiles. Conversations ended abruptly when a third party approached, and curtains twitched more frequently than before. In the grocer's shop, customers lowered their voices when speaking of the fete, glancing nervously toward the door. At the inn, where laughter usually rang loudest, talk seemed hushed, as though the very walls might repeat what they heard. Suspicion, once planted, had taken firm root, and every villager was careful, or tried to be, with their words. Miss Marple, seated by her fire with her knitting needles clicking softly, observed it all with serene detachment. She had, after all, seen such things before. In St. Mary Mead, years ago, a stolen brooch had once stirred similar unease, setting neighbor against neighbor until the truth emerged quite unexpectedly. She knew well that gossip, though often cruel and careless, had a curious way of brushing against the truth, like a cat weaving round one's ankles, not to be caught, but never straying too far. Thus she listened, she observed, and she remembered. For in every strained smile and every cautious word, Miss Marple found the faint echoes of patterns she had known all her life. It was at the post office, on a morning bright with frost, that Miss Marple observed the thing most others missed. Villagers came and went in their usual shuffle, the blacksmith collecting a parcel, Mrs. Pym fussing about the lateness of her magazine, and young Lily Dawlish with her basket of letters. Nothing remarkable, one might think. Yet, amid the ordinary rhythm, there passed a moment, brief but telling. As Mrs. Pennington exited, brushing snow from her coat sleeve, her eyes met those of Mr. Hargreaves, the solicitor. It was not a long look, nor overt in any way, but it lingered just enough, a flicker of recognition, a spark of something unspoken, before each turned briskly away, as though the sight of the other were quite unexpected. Mrs. Pennington busied herself with her gloves, fumbling more than necessary, while Mr. Hargreaves studied a notice pinned to the wall, though his eyes did not truly move across the words. To most, it was nothing. People look at one another every day, and no one remarks upon it. Yet Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime studying such details, tucked the moment neatly into the recesses of her mind. She knew from experience that people often reveal more in what they wish to conceal than in what they choose to say. A glance too long, an expression too swiftly checked, such things could prove more valuable than any official statement. And Miss Marple, ever so quietly, remembered. Chapter 2: Threads in the Frost. It was Miss Marple's particular gift to make questions seem like anything but. To the casual observer, she was simply a pleasant old lady, settled comfortably with her knitting, speaking in a voice that meandered as gently as a country brook. Yet within her seemingly idle chatter lay the kind of inquiries that nudged people into revealing more than they intended. At the draper's, she remarked upon the fine weather, only to drift, almost absent-mindedly, toward the subject of the fete. "Such a lively gathering," she said, adjusting her spectacles, "though I did think the holly display was rather crowded. One could hardly reach the teacups without a bit of a squeeze, could one?" The shop-girl agreed eagerly, mentioning, without prompting, that she had seen Mr. Hargreaves lingering there longer than was necessary. Later, over tea with Mrs. Pym, Miss Marple admired the woman's roses, then sighed about how difficult it must be to arrange so many stalls at once. All those personalities, so strong, and everyone wanting their way, she mused. Mrs. Pym, who prided herself on knowing everything worth knowing, immediately launched into a tale of disagreements between the vicar's wife and Mrs. Pennington, each claiming the holly wreaths as their rightful province. By evening, Miss Marple had gathered not facts, exactly, but fragments, small contradictions, curious emphases, moments where words strayed from truth into invention. To most, such scraps would seem useless. But to her, they were threads, thin but distinct, weaving a pattern just visible through the frost of rumor. And she, with patience born of years, began to knit them together. The smallest details often proved the most revealing, at least, to Miss Marple's way of thinking. Others might dismiss them as trifles, but she had long learned that trifles often whispered truths louder than declarations. It was in the hallway of Holly Cottage, when she returned a borrowed shawl to Mrs. Dawlish, that she noticed a scarf draped carelessly over a chair. It did not belong to the household, nor to Mrs. Dawlish herself, who declared it a frightful color. Yet no one claimed it. A misplaced scarf, left behind in the confusion of the fete, or hidden evidence, waiting quietly? Then there was the curious matter of the watch-chain. Mr. Hargreaves, the solicitor, usually wore it with such habitual pride that its absence was conspicuous. When Miss Marple innocently remarked on how "gentlemen do keep their time so well," he smiled thinly and said nothing. The faint flush on his cheek was answer enough. Most unsettling of all, however, was the scent, faint, elusive, yet unmistakable to anyone with a memory for gardens. As Miss Marple handled the fallen holly wreaths, she caught the bitter trace of almonds. Not the pleasant sweetness of marzipan, but the sharper, darker echo that called to mind poisons of the most unwholesome kind. She said nothing, of course. To remark upon such matters too soon was to risk closing doors before they properly opened. But inwardly she marked each clue, as one might set a pin in a map, tracing the path ahead. As Miss Marple moved quietly through Marleycombe, she found herself smiling inwardly at how very little people changed, no matter the village. To an untrained eye, the stories that fluttered about like autumn leaves might seem varied, even contradictory. But to her, they fell into familiar patterns, echoing tales she had long ago observed in St. Mary Mead. Here was Mrs. Pym, leaning in with eager certainty, declaring that the vicar's wife had been seen in a most suspicious temper. Yet Miss Marple recalled a similar case years before, when Mrs. Bartlett in St. Mary Mead had once accused her neighbor of theft, merely because she disliked the cut of the woman's hats. Prejudice often dressed itself as evidence. Then there was Mr. Trumbull, the baker, swearing the victim had enemies everywhere, though he could name none precisely. How like old Mr. Harper, who had once insisted a man must be guilty simply because he looked the sort. Miss Marple knew well that people often judged guilt by their own dislikes, not by facts. Even the quieter villagers betrayed themselves. A blush, a too quick denial, a shifting of eyes, all spoke louder than words. Miss Marple, with her needles clicking steadily, compared Marleycomb's gossip to the old stories of St. Mary Mead, and she knew the truth lay not in the chorus of accusations, but in the subtle rhythms beneath. Human nature, after all, did not vary nearly so much as people fancied. In a village brimming with chatter, silence can be more striking than any shouted word. Miss Marple noticed it first with Lily Dawlish, the postmistress's niece, a cheerful girl usually brimming with gossip. When asked, quite casually, whether she had enjoyed the fete, Lily's reply was unusually clipped. She fiddled with the edge of her apron, eyes darting toward the window as though the frost tracing the glass might rescue her from further inquiry. Others might have dismissed it as shyness, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered. She recalled many a time in St. Mary Mead when silence had proven the loudest clue of all. Young Mary Higgins, for instance, who once refused to speak of the evening she claimed to be at choir practice, until it emerged she had been elsewhere entirely. The tongue, when tied, often pointed more directly to the truth than when it wagged freely. Miss Marple did not press Lily. She merely asked after the girl's mother, remarked on the cold weather, and allowed the conversation to drift. But inwardly, she noted the girl's reluctance with great care. It was not the silence of grief or shock, but of knowledge, a silence that sought to conceal rather than to forget. And so, as she walked home beneath the bare elms, Miss Marple tucked that silence neatly alongside the misplaced scarf, the missing watch-chain, and the bitter almond scent. Each piece, however slight, was a stitch in the tapestry she quietly worked to unravel. Chapter 3. The Arrest of Thomas Larkin. By the week's end, Marleycombe had what it always longed for in such matters, an answer clear and simple. Constable Evans, with his round face and earnest manner, declared confidently that the case was all but solved. His suspect was Thomas Larkin, a gardener of long standing in the village, known for his gruff tongue, heavy boots, and a temper that flared as quickly as kindling. "Caught him fair and square," Evans announced at the King's Arms, his chest puffed out with the pride of decisive action. He argued with the deceased only hours before the fete, and half the village heard it. Quarrel over payment, it seems. He wanted more for the hedging, and tempers boiled over. The inspector from the county was expected the following morning, but Evans had no doubt he had already secured the culprit. Many villagers nodded along, relieved to have the matter neatly tied. A gardener with a bad disposition was a convenient villain. Mrs. Pym clucked her tongue and remarked she'd always thought Larkin a dreadful sort. Mr. Trumbull, the baker, chimed in with tales of how Larkin had once threatened to see him right over a disputed sack of flour. Such stories, long dormant, were polished and paraded as if proof itself. Miss Marple, listening quietly from her corner seat, said nothing. She merely continued her knitting, the needles flashing softly in the lamplight. She had seen this before, the quick arrest, the relief of certainty. But too often, she knew, it was the kind of certainty that crumbled at the lightest touch. Human nature, after all, was rarely so simple as Constable Evans believed. With Thomas Larkin behind bars, Marleycombe seemed, at first glance, to breathe a sigh of relief. In the grocer's shop, Mrs. Pym declared that she would sleep sounder now the brute was locked away. The vicar's wife, ever eager for harmony, insisted the village must rally around the police in gratitude. To them, the gardener's arrest restored order, a comforting end to the chaos that had shadowed the fete. Yet beneath these pronouncements ran a quieter current of doubt. Old Mr. Sedgwick, polishing his spectacles by the fire in the King's Arms, remarked to anyone who would listen that he never trusted a case that came together too neatly. Young Lily Dawlish kept her silence, but her eyes betrayed unease whenever the subject was raised. Even Mr. Trumbull, usually loud in his opinions, muttered that Thomas was quick to temper, yes, but not cruel, and certainly not sly enough for poison. Through all this, Miss Marple remained serenely inscrutable. She accepted her tea at the post-office with a smile, nodded along to the chatter in the bakery, and offered no pronouncement of her own. Her vague little smiles and gentle indeeds gave nothing away, though her blue eyes missed very little. It was not her way to argue against the tide, not yet. Villagers, she knew, often revealed more in their certainty than in their doubt. And so she listened, she knitted, and she filed away each whisper, each hesitation, as carefully as a seamstress tucks pins into a cushion. As Miss Marple sat by her window that evening, the fire crackling softly in the grate, she allowed her thoughts to wander to Thomas Larkin. The village, she reflected, had chosen its villain with remarkable ease. A gruff man with a weathered face, rough manners, and a fondness for ale was always a convenient figure to cast in the role of criminal. He was the sort upon whom suspicion clung like burrs to a coat. But Miss Marple's years of quiet observation had taught her that life, and crime, seldom aligned with appearances. She recalled other cases in St. Mary Mead where the loud and the quarrelsome had borne the brunt of suspicion, while the truly guilty stood quietly in the background, smiling politely. Human nature, she mused, was far more subtle than Constable Evans gave it credit for. Too obvious, she murmured to herself, setting down her knitting. The argument between Larkin and the deceased might well have been heated, but anger spoken in the open rarely translated into murder. Poison, after all, was a weapon chosen not by the impulsive, but by the calculating. And Thomas Larkin, for all his temper, was no strategist. Her mind turned again to Lily Dawlish's silence, to the faint almond scent she had noticed, and to the glance exchanged between two villagers at the fete. Those small, delicate threads told a story more intricate than Evans's simple net. And Miss Marple, patient as ever, was determined to follow them. That night, while the frost lay thick upon the hedgerows and the village slept beneath a brittle moon, Miss Marple sat alone with her knitting. The fire had burned low, leaving the room in a mellow half-light, and the rhythmic click of her needles filled the silence. It was in such quiet moments that her mind worked most clearly, arranging fragments of memory like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. She found herself returning to the fete, to the very moment when the victim had staggered near the holly wreath display. There had been gasps, a flurry of motion, the clatter of a teacup dropping, but above it all she remembered a single phrase, faint, but distinct enough to lodge in her mind. "Not here! Not now!" the man had murmured, clutching at his chest before falling. The words had been dismissed as the incoherent ramblings of a dying man. Yet to Miss Marple they carried weight. They suggested urgency, resistance, even secrecy. It was not merely a man overcome by sudden illness, but one who recognized, perhaps too late, that something carefully plotted had reached its dreadful conclusion. Her needles paused mid-stitch as she considered the implications. If he had known danger was upon him, then it stood to reason he had also known the hand behind it. Such knowledge, even unspoken, was far more dangerous than Constable Evans realized. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with a thoughtful hum. The phrase was no dying delirium. It was a clue. Chapter 4. Secrets by Candlelight. The soft glow of candlelight illuminated the vicarage drawing-room that evening, as a small gathering of villagers lingered after supper. The conversation, though draped in polite tones, edged ever closer to the matter at hand, the death at Holly Cottage. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a high-backed chair with her hands folded neatly in her lap, listened as threads of gossip wove themselves into something far more telling. It was Mrs. Pym, naturally, who first allowed the words to slip. "It always did seem unfair, you know," she murmured, leaning forward confidentially. Holly Cottage passing entirely to the Harcourt side, when the Larkins had every bit as much claim through the maternal line. The statement, once uttered, opened a door that others seemed all too willing to step through. Mr. Sedgwick, the solicitor, cleared his throat, clearly uneasy. Such matters were settled decades ago. There's little point in dredging up. But already the talk had gathered momentum. Whispers spoke of quarrels during boundary disputes, of letters written but never acknowledged, of bitterness that had festered quietly beneath the veneer of village civility. Holly Cottage, it seemed, was not merely a charming dwelling with ivy on its walls. It was a symbol of what had been won by some and denied to others. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly as she recalled similar quarrels in St. Mary Mead, where land was often more valuable for pride than for pounds. Beneath the laughter at summer fetes and the polite nods in church pews, old grievances had lingered like smoke that never quite cleared. And in such grievances, she knew, lay fertile ground for motives darker than any candlelit chatter might dare to admit. It was later that same evening, as the village dispersed into the frosty night, that Miss Marple found herself walking beside Mrs. Weatherby, the black-clad widow who lived in the little thatched cottage near the brook. The woman's breath came in soft clouds against the air, and her gloved hand clutched the edge of her shawl as though drawing courage from its folds. "Miss Marple," she said at last, her voice low, "I cannot rest until I speak of it. You see, I quarrelled with Mr. Harcourt not a week before he died." She stopped, the crunch of gravel underfoot seeming loud in the silence. "He accused me, quite unfairly, of failing to return a parcel of his late wife's lace. A trivial thing, perhaps, but he spoke with such a venom. I told him never again would I set foot in Holly Cottage." Her voice faltered, and she glanced quickly about, as though fearful that unseen ears might be listening. Miss Marple regarded her with gentle eyes. "And yet," she said softly, You carried that quarrel in silence." Mrs. Weatherby gave a trembling sigh. "Yes, and now that he is gone, I fear it may look as though I wished him ill. But I swear to you, Miss Marple, I did not." The old lady laid a comforting hand on the widow's arm, her mind already filing away the detail. Quarrels, however small, often mattered greatly when death came too suddenly. The following afternoon, Holly Cottage lay hushed, its windows dim against the pale winter sun. Miss Marple, invited under the pretense of helping sort the late Mr. Harcourt's papers, moved with quiet precision through the sitting-room. While others busied themselves with ledgers and dusty boxes, her gaze lingered on the mantelpiece clock, a handsome brass piece that seemed, curiously, to sit ever so slightly askew. With a gentle adjustment, she found what she half expected, a folded letter, yellowed at the edges, pressed behind the clock's casing. Drawing it out with careful fingers, she noted the tremor of unease in the air as Mrs. Harcourt's niece gasped. The letter was short, written in a hurried hand. "If you proceed, you will regret it. Betrayal does not go unanswered. Remember what was promised at Holly Cottage. I will not be cast aside." The words were unsigned, but they carried an intensity that prickled the skin. It was not the writing of a stranger. It was the sort of message that spoke of long acquaintance, of trust soured into bitterness. Miss Marple read the letter twice, her face composed, betraying nothing of her thoughts. "Most curious," she murmured, folding it neatly once more. In her mind, she saw not just a note, but a glimpse into the darker currents that ran beneath Marleycomb's placid surface. Letters, she knew, often revealed more than people intended to admit aloud. And this one whispered of betrayal sharp enough to kill. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window, the lamplight casting a small pool of gold across her writing desk. Outside, the night was still, save for the distant hoot of an owl and the rustle of bare branches against the pane. She placed the folded letter upon the table before her and regarded it with calm, steady eyes. It was not the first time she had held a clue of this nature, a scrap of paper that hinted at deeper shadows. And she knew well enough that such knowledge was a double-edged thing. In the hands of the police, it might lead to hasty conclusions. In the wrong ears, it could spark panic. But in the eyes of a guilty party, it could prove dangerous indeed. She remembered past instances in St. Mary Mead where a whispered suspicion had brought retaliation quicker than proof. People, she reflected, were rarely rational when secrets pressed too close to the surface. They lashed out, sometimes blindly, to protect what mattered most. Miss Marple folded her hands together and gave a small nod, as though affirming something to herself. "Not yet," she murmured. "The truth, like good tea, must steep in its own time." She tucked the letter away in her knitting basket, where it lay hidden among the soft folds of wool. There it would remain, safe from idle eyes, until the moment came when revealing it would do more good than harm. Chapter 5: A Shadow over Holly Cottage. The frost still clung to the hedgerows when news flew through Marleycombe like a startled flock of starlings. Holly Cottage had been broken into during the night. Villagers crowded the lane, their scarves tucked tight against the morning chill, as Constable Evans tried, with limited success, to keep them back from the garden gate. Inside, the once tidy rooms bore signs of a hurried search. Drawers yanked open, papers strewn across carpets, and ornaments displaced, yet curiously, nothing of real value seemed missing. The silver candlesticks remained on the mantel, the modest jewelry untouched in its box. It was as though the intruder had not sought riches, but something particular, something hidden. Mrs. Harcourt's niece wrung her hands in agitation. It must have been thieves, surely, or boys up to mischief. Yet her voice wavered, betraying uncertainty. Miss Marple, quietly present, surveyed the disarray with her usual calm. Her eyes lingered on the writing desk, its contents scattered like leaves after a storm. One half-burnt sheet of paper, fallen near the hearth, caught her notice, an unfinished letter, smudged with haste, bearing the words, "Cannot allow the truth," before the ink trailed off. She said nothing at first, only smoothing the crumpled corner of her handkerchief. But in her mind, the puzzle took on a sharper outline. Someone had risked exposure, entering by night, in desperate pursuit of knowledge or to silence it. The villagers outside speculated wildly, their voices rising in the frosty air. Yet Miss Marple knew this was no act of common burglary. This was fear made flesh, fear of secrets that had not yet come to light. By the following afternoon, Marleycombe seemed a village under a silent cloud. The break-in at Holly Cottage had unsettled even the most stoic of its inhabitants. Neighbors lingered at doorsteps longer than usual, voices lowered, eyes darting nervously as though the very hedges might conceal a lurking figure. At the grocer's, Mrs. Pym declared with dramatic certainty that the burglary proved Thomas Larkin's guilt, for had he not been released briefly while evidence was sorted? Yet, at the same counter, Mr. Sedgwick pointed out that Larkin was seen mending a fence at the far end of the village that same night. The contradiction only deepened the unease. Whispers threaded through every gathering. If it was not Larkin, then who? To think of an unknown culprit still at liberty, perhaps among them in church pews, or smiling politely at the post office, was enough to set hearts quivering. Doors were locked earlier, curtains drawn tight before dusk, and even the vicar's wife admitted she kept a candle burning all night for comfort. Miss Marple, knitting calmly by her parlor fire, listened to these accounts with quiet gravity. She knew fear had its uses. It loosened tongues, quickened gossip, and laid bare truths people might otherwise keep hidden. Yet it also distorted, painting innocent gestures with suspicion. The village trembled, yes, but within that trembling she sensed the guilty one watching closely, measuring just how near the truth might be creeping. It was during a polite afternoon visit to Holly Cottage, under the pretext of helping tidy after the break-in, that Miss Marple noticed something others had overlooked. On the rug near the writing desk lay a faint smear, not mud, as Constable Evans had assumed, but a trace of wax, pale green and flecked with holly leaves. Her eyes twinkled as she bent, lightly dabbing it with her handkerchief. Pale green wax, she recalled, had dripped from the festive candles decorating the holly wreath table at the church fete. The candles had been distinctive, made by the vicar's niece as part of the craft stall. There could be no mistaking them. Someone who had stood long enough at that table, close enough for wax to cling to a shoe or hem, had later walked here, into the heart of the cottage. It was not proof, certainly, but it was a connection, a thread tying the cheerful bustle of the fete to the dark intrusion of the night. Miss Marple said nothing aloud, only complimented Mrs. Harcourt's niece on her courage in facing the disorder. But as she folded her gloves neatly upon her lap, her mind worked steadily. The same hand that had knocked over wreaths and candles at the fete now rifled through papers by candlelight. It was no stranger prowling Marleycomb's lanes. The intruder was someone within their circle, someone who had mingled among holly and song as naturally as any neighbor. The following day found Miss Marple at the vicarage, pouring out a delicate china cup of Darjeeling for Inspector Graves, who had called to confer with Constable Evans. The inspector was a brisk man, fond of plain facts and impatient with old wives' notions. Yet he accepted the tea with a courteous nod, settling into the high-backed chair opposite Miss Marple. "It's simple enough, you see," Graves declared, adjusting his spectacles. "The burglary proves Larkin's hand in all this. Temper and opportunity. One hardly needs more." Miss Marple's eyes softened, her needles clicking gently as she resumed her knitting. "And yet, Inspector," she said mildly, "one cannot help noticing how very little was taken. Quite an untidy sort of thief, don't you think? Almost as though he searched for a thing far more particular than silver." Graves gave a short laugh. "With respect, madam, thieves are rarely tidy creatures. We shan't waste time on candle wax and carpets when the man himself fits the bill so neatly." She smiled, the kind of faint, untroubled smile that gave nothing away. "Indeed. But in my experience, Inspector, the neatest explanations are often the ones that unravel most quickly." The inspector, distracted by his tea, let the comment drift past him like smoke. But Miss Marple tucked the exchange into her mind. She knew the police would not look further until forced. And sometimes, she reflected, that was precisely the opportunity a murderer relied upon. Chapter 6. The net draws tighter. The December days shortened into dusky afternoons, and with each passing hour Marleycombe seemed to hum with whispered revelations. Over tea tables and under frosted hedgerows, the villagers' secrets began to seep into the open, not in bold declarations, but in half-dropped hints and hurried corrections that Miss Marple, ever attentive, gathered like fallen petals. Money, as it so often did, lay at the heart of several murmurings. Mr. Harcourt had spoken recently of altering his will, and there were those, not least his niece, who stood to gain or lose considerably by the stroke of his pen. The uncertainty alone was enough to kindle resentment. Then there was jealousy, that old and poisonous companion of small villages. It was said in lowered voices at the grocer's that Harcourt had been seen too often in the company of Mrs. Weatherby, the widow by the brook. Some whispered it was companionship, others something warmer. And if so, who might have found such attentions unwelcome? But the most intriguing murmur reached Miss Marple's ears in the post-office, when two ladies, thinking themselves unobserved, spoke of a hidden affection between Harcourt and a woman already promised elsewhere. No names were spoken, but the tone was unmistakable. There had been hearts entangled where propriety demanded silence. As she listened, Miss Marple's needles moved in steady rhythm. Money, jealousy, love, each thread could bind a person to desperation. And when desperation mingled with opportunity, the pattern that emerged was rarely innocent. It was during a brisk afternoon walk to the village green that Miss Marple encountered young Timothy Blake, the vicar's grandson, who was kicking a leather ball across the frosted grass. He stopped when he saw her, all eager politeness, and asked if she would like to see the robin's nest tucked in the holly hedge. Miss Marple, ever patient with children, agreed. As he led her along, Timothy chattered in the guileless way children do. "It was just like when I saw Mr. Harcourt that day at the fete," he said suddenly. "He dropped his watch chain on the ground. I thought he'd lost it, but then a lady picked it up quick and slipped it in her pocket. She told me not to say a word." Miss Marple's eyes, though kindly, sharpened at once. "Oh, and can you remember which lady, my dear?" The boy screwed up his face in thought, then shook his head. "She had red gloves," he said at last, with the certainty of a child who notices small things adults overlook. Miss Marple smiled warmly, thanking him for his sharp eyes, and gave him a sixpence for sweets before sending him on his way. But as she walked homeward, her thoughts were anything but light. Red gloves, a trivial detail to most, yet in the delicate weave of a mystery, it might prove to be the very stitch that held the fabric together. That evening, Miss Marple lingered a little longer at her parlor window, her knitting resting idly in her lap. The village lay quiet beneath a dusting of frost, but she sensed an unease in the air, a weight that was not merely the cold. For several days now she had felt eyes upon her, a glance that lingered a fraction too long as she left the grocer's, or the hush that fell the instant she entered the post-office. Her discoveries, the hidden letter, the wax upon the rug, the child's recollection of red gloves, were beginning to form a pattern she could almost see clearly. But patterns, once visible to her, rarely remained concealed from those who feared exposure. And that, she reflected, was the most dangerous moment of all. She had lived long enough to know that the guilty, when cornered, often sensed it before anyone spoke a word. They smelled suspicion like smoke, and they struck quickly when threatened. Her hands resumed their knitting, though the yarn trembled slightly in her fingers. "I must tread softly," she murmured, "as one does on thin ice." It would not do to show her hand too soon. A murderer, made desperate, could be far more reckless than a thief. Yet she also knew the truth was close, so close she could feel it pressing at the edges of silence. The real question was whether she could bring it to light before the guilty hand turned against her. Miss Marple's fire had burned low, casting the parlor into a mellow glow, when her plan began to take shape. She sat quite still, her knitting needles resting in the basket at her side, her hands folded primly upon her lap. To the casual eye, she was merely an elderly lady lost in thought, but behind those mild blue eyes, every stitch of observation was being woven into a careful design. The killer, she reasoned, had already betrayed themselves through small things, a hurried hand in a letter, a smear of wax, a child's innocent memory. Yet proof alone would never suffice. What was required was something subtler, an opportunity for the guilty conscience to betray itself under the strain of pressure. She recalled many such instances from St. Mary Mead, where a murderer had unmasked themselves not by evidence, but by their own inability to bear the weight of deception. People, she knew, always revealed themselves when their pride or fear was touched. So she resolved upon a quiet snare, not of ropes or locks, but of words and circumstance. A tea, perhaps, or a simple gathering, where a remark placed with seeming innocence might strike like a dart. If her instincts were true, the guilty one would falter. Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest of smiles as she reached once more for her knitting. A trap was being laid, delicate, invisible, and as inevitable as frost upon the morning grass. Chapter 7. The Gathering at Holly Cottage. It was with her usual air of gentle helpfulness that Miss Marple suggested a small gathering at Holly Cottage. She couched it, of course, in the language of kindness, a little comfort for poor Mrs. Harcourt's niece, after all the dreadful business, she told the vicar's wife, and a way for the village to show its support. No one suspected the true purpose behind her mild blue eyes. The invitations were simple, little notes written in a hand as neat as pressed lavender. They were delivered by hand, tucked into baskets or slipped discreetly through letter slots. Each was phrased with equal warmth, so that no one might feel singled out. And yet, Miss Marple was particular in her choice of guests. She asked those whose names had circled in whispers since the fete, the widow by the brook, the solicitor, the niece with her fluttering nerves, even Constable Evans and Inspector Graves. When questioned lightly by Mrs. Pym as to why she included Thomas Larkin, newly released from custody, Miss Marple smiled her vague smile. "Oh, I think it will do the poor man good to feel himself back among neighbors. A cup of tea can mend a great many rifts, don't you agree?" Behind the softness of her words, however, lay a sharper intent. She meant to place each player in the same room, under the same roof where secrets had festered. There, she would let the conversation take its course, guided by her unobtrusive hand. And if her instincts were correct, the guilty heart, unable to bear the strain of calm company, would tremble and reveal itself. The gathering began with the clinking of china and the polite hum of voices. Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, her eyes twinkling kindly over the rim of her spectacles. She spoke little at first, letting the others fall into easy chatter about the weather, the lateness of the post, and the scarcity of sugar. Yet, as naturally as knitting one row after another, she began to weave her questions into the fabric of conversation. "Oh, Mrs. Pym, wasn't it you who remarked how strange it was that the holly wreaths were moved before the judging? I always think such little disarrangements can be most curious." She let the words drift, her tone innocent, though she watched the quick flicker in one guest's eyes. To the vicar's wife, she observed, "It must have been so difficult, arranging the fete after the quarrels over the table placements. People do become so heated about small things." The remark was met with an embarrassed cough and averted glances. Even Thomas Larkin, shifting uneasily in his chair, was drawn into her gentle net. "You were seen with the late Mr. Harcourt that morning, were you not? How very distressing for you to be so misunderstood." The gardener muttered something indistinct, though Miss Marple's ears caught the denial hidden within. With every sip of tea, every seemingly harmless recollection, she tugged at threads of memory and guilt. Soon enough, the tapestry of the evening would reveal its flaws, and perhaps its weaver. It came as softly and suddenly as a dropped stitch in a piece of knitting, small, almost invisible, yet altering the whole pattern. The room was warm with lamplight, the scent of fruit-cake and strong tea drifting lazily, and Miss Marple's guests were lulled into that peculiar state where tongues grow loose. The talk had meandered to the unfortunate collapse at the fete, with each villager offering some vague recollection. Mrs. Pym insisted once more that it had been a weak heart, while the vicar's wife gently maintained it must have been shock. Then, quite without prompting, Mr. Elwood, the normally reserved churchwarden, leaned forward and declared with surprising certainty, "Well, anyone could see he hadn't touched the marzipan slice. It was the holly cake he ate just before." The words trailed off, his face paling as he realized the weight of what he had revealed. There had been no public mention of which cake the victim had taken. Only those at closest hand could have known. A silence fell, broken only by the rattle of a teaspoon on porcelain. Miss Marple, serene as ever, merely inclined her head, as though filing away some minor household detail. Yet her eyes, bright with quiet intelligence, lingered a moment longer on Mr. Elwood's trembling hands. It was no grand confession, no dramatic outburst. Just a slip, a careless remark that gave away knowledge no innocent villager ought to possess. And Miss Marple, naturally, missed nothing. Inspector Graves had sat through the tea with an air of polite tolerance, accustomed to humoring village chatter while relying on his own methods. Yet, as the room settled into uneasy silence after Mr. Elwood's slip, he found himself replaying the old lady's gentle questions in his mind. Each had seemed so harmless, almost idle, yet now they formed a chain as strong as iron. He glanced at Miss Marple, who sat with her knitting in her lap, needles poised but motionless. There was nothing triumphant in her manner, only the mild patience of one who had long awaited this moment. "You see, Inspector," she said softly, "knowledge is a very dangerous possession. Mr. Elwood could only have known about the holly cake if he had watched very closely indeed, too closely." The churchwarden sputtered, his protest breaking against the weight of his own words. Graves, at last, saw the truth for what it was. The burglary at Holly Cottage, the quarrels whispered of, the cryptic letter, all threads that Miss Marple had already seen woven into a single damning picture. With a grave nod, the inspector straightened. "Mr. Elwood, I believe you'd best come along with me." Around the tea-table, villagers gasped, their fear mingled with a strange relief. And Miss Marple, serene and composed, lowered her eyes once more to her knitting, the pattern resuming as though nothing more extraordinary had occurred than the turning of a page. Chapter 8. The Truth Beneath the Holly. The parlor at Holly Cottage seemed smaller than ever, the lamplight pressing close upon every anxious face. Mr. Elwood sat rigid, his complexion ashen, while Inspector Graves stood ready beside him, notebook in hand. Yet it was Miss Marple, with her quiet authority, who commanded the room. She folded her knitting neatly in her lap, and spoke with the calm clarity of one reciting a well-learned lesson. "You see," she began, "it was never the holly wreaths or the arguments over the table that mattered. Those were clever distractions. The true scheme lay in something much simpler, a cup of tea." A collective murmur rippled through the gathering. Miss Marple's eyes, kind yet unflinching, settled on Mr. Elwood. The victim, Mr. Harcourt, was meant to drink the poisoned tea. But the cups were arranged so that no one would suspect the switch. A slight shuffle, a casual exchange, and the right cup found its way to the right lips. Only someone with a steady hand and an appearance of complete respectability could manage it unseen. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle like dust upon the polished furniture. And so, when Mr. Harcourt collapsed, we all assumed it a sudden ailment, or perhaps a quarrel taken too much to heart. But the quarrels, too, were staged. Arguments whispered loudly enough to be remembered, carefully planted so suspicion might fall elsewhere. Miss Marple's tone softened. It was very nearly a perfect deception. Very nearly. But in such matters, human nature always betrays itself. And you, Mr. Elwood, betrayed yourself with knowledge you could not have had, save by guilt. The silence that followed was colder than any winter frost. Inspector Graves cleared his throat, but it was Miss Marple who continued, her voice as gentle as if she were explaining a domestic matter over seed cake. As with most dreadful things, the root was not so very complicated. It was greed, plain, stubborn greed. Her gaze moved to the faces around her, pausing at those who leaned forward, wide-eyed. Holly Cottage, for all its ivy and charm, carries more than fond memories. It was left in dispute, you see, with certain papers never properly settled. Mr. Harcourt had the stronger claim, but Mr. Elwood believed it ought to have been his family's all along. The churchwarden shifted uneasily, his hands knotting together. And so, Miss Marple went on, resentment, long harbored and carefully masked, grew into something darker. Each Christmas fete, each gathering within these walls, only sharpened that bitterness. When news came that Mr. Harcourt meant to set the matter straight once and for all, transferring deeds, perhaps even selling, well, the thought of losing what he fancied his birthright was more than Mr. Elwood could bear. She let the words linger, heavy as falling snow. An old grievance, dressed up as principle, but in truth nothing more noble than coveting what belonged to another. That, combined with opportunity and the confidence of his trusted position, proved too much temptation. A long sigh rose from the villagers, part sorrow, part recognition. For who had not, at one time or another, witnessed how greed could twist even the most respectable soul? For a moment after Miss Marple's calm declaration, the drawing-room at Holly Cottage seemed to hold its breath. The ticking of the clock on the mantel grew suddenly loud, as though it alone dared to disturb the silence. Faces turned toward Mr. Elwood, a respectable man of the parish council, known for his tidy garden and punctuality at evensong. That such a figure could be unmasked as the author of something so dreadful left the villagers in a state of stunned bewilderment. Mrs. Pym pressed a gloved hand to her lips. The baker muttered a prayer under his breath, while the vicar's wife stared at the floor, her cheeks drained of color. There was astonishment, certainly, but threaded through it was a subtler current, the shame of having trusted appearances too easily, and the reluctant recognition of Miss Marple's unerring eye. "I should never have believed it," whispered Mrs. Arkwright, shaking her head. "Never." And yet, some part of the gathering could not help but feel an odd, uneasy admiration, not for the crime itself, but for the cleverness with which it had been concealed. To have brewed poison beneath the veil of polite conversation, to have plotted while smiling in the very rooms where carols were sung, it was both ghastly and chillingly precise. Miss Marple, however, merely folded her hands in her lap, her expression one of quiet sadness. She, more than anyone, knew that evil in the village seldom arrived with a dramatic flourish, but slipped in quietly, wearing a familiar face. When at last the inspector gave the signal and Mr. Elwood was led away, a hush lingered in the room like the fading echo of church bells. The villagers shifted uneasily, murmuring in low tones, uncertain whether to speak of relief or sorrow. Into that fragile silence Miss Marple's voice came, soft yet steady, carrying the authority of one who had watched many such dramas unfold across the years. "You see," she said, almost as if speaking to herself, "human nature never truly changes. Whether in Marleycombe or St. Mary Mead, one finds the same small envies, the same grudges quietly nursed, the same follies dressed up as virtue. They are but patterns, repeating themselves in different guises. Her eyes, bright and bird-like, scanned the company, not with accusation, but with a deep, knowing kindness. That is why, when something dreadful occurs, it is rarely a stranger to blame. The truth, more often than not, lies close at hand, among the faces we think we know best. The words settled heavily, yet not without a measure of comfort. For in them was the reminder that while darkness might creep into the most ordinary of cottages, so too did light, in the form of understanding and the quiet courage of those willing to face the truth. Miss Marple folded her knitting into her bag, and with a gentle smile, asked if someone might pour her another cup of tea. The storm, at least for now, had passed. In the days that followed, Marleycombe slowly righted itself, as villages always do after a storm. The church bells rang once more with their steady, comforting peal, summoning parishioners to prayer. Gardens, left untended during the height of gossip and fear, were clipped back into order, rose bushes trimmed, leaves swept neatly from cottage paths. And the talk, which had so recently bristled with suspicion, softened once more to gentler topics: the weather, the jam for next year's fete, and who might host the Christmas pageant. Holly Cottage itself, with its shuttered windows and ivy-draped eaves, stood quietly at the edge of the green. A holly wreath still hung upon its door, a symbol both festive and faintly sombre, reminding all who passed of the secrets once whispered beneath its roof. Life had resumed, yes, but the memory of betrayal lingered, like the faint scent of smoke after a fire. As for Miss Marple, she returned to her accustomed place by the hearth in her own sitting-room, needles clicking steadily as she worked at a length of pale blue wool. She was content, for order had been restored, and though she never sought admiration, her quiet diligence had once again safeguarded the village from unseen harm. And now, dear listener, let me leave you with a question. Would you have noticed the faint bitterness in the tea, or the guilty glance that passed across the room? Perhaps you would. Or perhaps, like so many, you might have missed it entirely. Thank you for joining me in the Holly Cottage Mystery. Do share your thoughts below, and tell me what details caught your eye most keenly. Until next time, may your evenings be cozy, your tea warm, and your mysteries delightfully puzzling.